You can be surrounded by people, respected, even needed, and still feel completely alone, because loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of connection that actually reaches you. And if you don't understand that, you will keep trying to fix it with more noise, more interaction, more distraction, and none of it will work because the problem is deeper, and Elijah exposes this in a moment most people overlook. A prophet who just witnessed fire fall from heaven, who just stood against hundreds of false prophets, now running alone into the wilderness, collapsing under a tree and saying something that sounds final. "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life." 1 Kings chapter 19. And this is where everything becomes real, because this is not weakness after failure. This is collapse after victory, and that destroys the illusion that success protects you from loneliness, because it doesn't. If anything, it can isolate you even more. And that is the first lesson. Loneliness does not come from losing, it often comes after winning, when no one around you understands what it cost you to get there. And if you don't recognize that, you will misread your own condition. You will think something is wrong with you, instead of understanding what is actually happening inside you. A man alone in the desert, heat pressing down, body exhausted, mind overwhelmed, and he lies down expecting not to wake up. And instead of a lecture, instead of correction, something simple happens. An angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." 1 Kings chapter 19. And this is where the second lesson becomes unavoidable. Loneliness intensifies when your body is depleted, because physical exhaustion distorts emotional reality, and this is not abstract, it is observable. Lack of sleep increases emotional reactivity. Hunger affects decision-making. Isolation amplifies negative thought patterns, and Scripture addresses this before anything spiritual is corrected. Elijah eats, drinks, rests, and only then moves forward. And most people skip this completely. They try to solve emotional collapse with thoughts while ignoring the physical state that is feeding it. And that is why nothing changes, because the foundation remains unstable. And if you ignore that, you will keep trying to fix something at the wrong level, and that guarantees failure. A cave, dark, enclosed, silent, and Elijah retreats into it, not because he needs strategy, but because he wants to disappear. And this is where the third lesson cuts deep. Isolation feels safe when you are overwhelmed, but it slowly becomes the place that traps you. Because what begins as recovery becomes avoidance, and avoidance strengthens the very feeling you are trying to escape. And God does not leave him there. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" 1 Kings chapter 19. Not because he doesn't know, but because Elijah needs to hear himself explain it. "I am the only one left." And that statement is not fact. It is perception, shaped by isolation. And this is exactly how loneliness distorts reality. It convinces you that your situation is unique, that no one understands, that you are alone in a way that cannot be changed. And once that belief settles, you stop reaching out, you stop engaging. You reinforce the isolation that created the distortion in the first place, and that is the prison, not the cave, but the belief that the cave is the only place you belong. A mountain, wind tearing through rocks, ground shaking, fire breaking across the surface, and Elijah waiting, expecting something dramatic, something overwhelming, something undeniable. But Scripture makes a point that changes everything. The Lord was not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, and after the fire, and after the fire came a gentle whisper. 1 Kings chapter 19. And this is where the fourth lesson becomes unavoidable. Loneliness is not always broken by noise. It is broken by connection that reaches deeper than noise ever could. Because Elijah was not waiting for volume, he was waiting for presence. And most people confuse the two. They fill their lives with sound, with content, with constant input, thinking it will fix the emptiness. But it only delays it, because what they need is something quieter, something more precise, something that actually meets them where they are. And if you avoid that, you will stay surrounded and still feel alone. because nothing is reaching the place that actually needs to be addressed. A correction, not of his situation, but of his belief. I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal. 1 Kings chapter 19. And this is where the fifth lesson cuts through the illusion. You are not as alone as you think, but loneliness convinces you that you are, and that belief shapes everything. Because if you believe no one is there, you stop looking, and if you stop looking, you confirm what you already believe, and that cycle reinforces itself until it feels permanent. And this is not just spiritual, it is psychological, confirmation bias. Your mind filters for what supports what you already believe and ignores what contradicts it. And that is exactly what Elijah was doing, not seeing the 7,000 because his perception was locked on isolation. And once that is corrected, everything shifts, not because new people appeared, but because the truth was revealed. And that is what most people need. Not more people, but a correction of what they believe about the people already there. A field, a man plowing, life moving normally, and Elijah throws his cloak over him, calling him into something new, and Elisha leaves everything to follow. 1 Kings chapter 19. And this is where the sixth lesson becomes practical. Connection is built through movement, not waiting, because Elijah did not stay in the cave hoping someone would find him. He moved, and in that movement, connection appeared, and this is where most people get stuck. They wait to feel less alone before they engage. But engagement is what reduces loneliness, and if you reverse that order, you stay in place expecting a change that requires action, and that is why nothing shifts, because the process is being avoided, not because it is impossible, but because it feels uncomfortable, and discomfort is often misinterpreted as a sign to stop instead of a signal that something is changing. A journey back, not perfect, not fully resolved, but different, because Elijah is no longer alone in the same way, not because his environment changed completely, but because his position within it did. And that is the seventh lesson. Loneliness does not disappear instantly. It is replaced gradually as you change how you respond to it, and that requires repetition, stepping out again, connecting again, correcting your thinking again, because if you stop, the old pattern returns. And that is why many people feel like nothing works, because they try once, they step out once, they engage once, and when it doesn't fix everything immediately, they retreat again, reinforcing the same cycle they are trying to break. And without consistency, nothing holds, no matter how correct the action was. And this is where everything comes together, because loneliness is not solved by a single moment. It is solved by a series of corrections that change how you live, how you think, how you engage, and if you ignore that, you will keep searching for a quick solution to something that requires a process. And that is the final lesson. You don't escape loneliness by accident. You move out of it deliberately, step by step, correcting what you believe, adjusting how you respond, and refusing to stay in the place that once felt safe but is now keeping you stuck. Because Elijah did not remain under the tree, he did not stay in the cave. He moved, and that movement is what changed everything. Not instantly, but decisively. And if you are waiting for loneliness to leave before you act, you will wait longer than necessary. But if you begin to move, even while you feel it, even while it is still present, then something begins to shift. That shift is what turns isolation into connection, not by removing the feeling first, but by changing your position inside it until it no longer defines you. A road leaving the wilderness, quiet, dust rising under each step. No crowd, no applause, just movement after collapse. And that matters more than the collapse itself, because most people don't stay stuck at the lowest point. They stay stuck at the moment after it, when nothing feels dramatic anymore, and they are expected to move again. And this is where the next lesson becomes unavoidable. Loneliness does not trap you at your lowest, it traps you in hesitation after you've already survived it. Because Elijah could have remained under that tree, could have justified staying in that cave, could have built a life around that moment of exhaustion, and it would have felt reasonable, but he was told something simple: go back the way you came. 1 Kings chapter 19. not a new path, not a different life, back. And that is where most people resist, because going back means re-entering the same world that hurt you, the same environment, the same risks. And if your belief has not changed, you will interpret that as danger instead of direction. And that is how people stay isolated, not because they have nowhere to go, but because they refuse to return to the place where connection is possible. And this is exactly what happens in real life. Someone leaves a relationship, a job, a community, and instead of healing and engaging, they withdraw completely. They build a smaller world, safer, quieter, more controlled. And at first it feels like relief, but over time it becomes confinement, because nothing new enters, nothing challenges the belief that isolation is safer, and that belief becomes your limit. A simple moment, a message not answered, a call not returned, a conversation avoided, and you tell yourself it doesn't matter. But those small decisions are where loneliness grows, not in dramatic events, but in repeated avoidance of connection. And this is where the next lesson cuts deeper than most expect. Loneliness is reinforced by micro decisions you justify every day, because every time you choose not to reach out, not to respond, not to engage, you strengthen the pattern that keeps you isolated, and over time, that pattern becomes automatic. You stop even noticing it, and then you wonder why nothing changes. And that is exactly why Elijah was not told to stay and reflect. He was told to move, because movement interrupts patterns that thinking alone cannot break. And if you ignore that, you will keep analyzing your loneliness without ever changing it, and analysis without action becomes another form of avoidance. A field again, but this time, notice the detail most people miss. Elisha is not waiting to be found. He is working, engaged, present. And that is where connection happens, not in withdrawal, but in movement. And this is where the next lesson becomes practical. You find connection where you are active, not where you are passive, because activity places you in environments where interaction becomes possible, where shared effort creates natural connection. And this is not abstract, it is observable. People meet through work, through shared tasks, through consistent presence, not through isolation. And if you remove yourself from those environments, you remove the possibility of connection, and then you interpret the absence of connection as proof that you are alone, when in reality, you have removed yourself from the places where connection forms. A quiet moment, sitting alone again, but this time the silence feels different, not empty, but stable. And this is where the next lesson becomes clear. Loneliness is not eliminated by constant presence of others. It is transformed by your relationship with being alone. Because if being alone feels like loss, you will always chase noise. But if being alone becomes stable, you no longer depend on noise to feel connected. And that changes how you approach people. You are no longer trying to fill a gap. You are choosing connection from a place of stability. And that difference changes everything. Because now your interactions are not driven by need, but by intention. And that creates stronger, more genuine connections instead of temporary relief. And this is where the shift becomes real, because Elijah did not become someone who was never alone again. He became someone who was no longer controlled by what loneliness made him believe. And that is the final part of this process, not removing every moment of isolation, but removing the power it has over your decisions, your thinking, your direction. Because once that power is gone, loneliness no longer defines you. It becomes a state you move through, not a place you stay in. And that is the difference between those who remain stuck and those who move forward. One waits for the feeling to disappear. The other changes their position inside it. And that change is what breaks the cycle, not instantly, but permanently. A message delivered in fear can trap you for years if you accept it as truth. And Elijah received one that should not have defined him. May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. 1 Kings chapter 19. A threat from Jezebel. A sentence spoken in anger, and yet it redirected everything. He ran. He hid. He collapsed. And this is where the next lesson becomes unavoidable. Loneliness often begins when you believe a voice that was never meant to guide you, because not every voice carries authority, but every voice has influence if you accept it. And that is exactly how mental isolation forms. Someone says something, a rejection, a betrayal, a judgment, and instead of processing it, you internalize it. You treat it as fact. And once it becomes fact in your mind, it shapes your actions. You withdraw, you protect, you avoid, and over time, that reaction becomes your environment, and then you call it reality. A real situation. Someone leaves you without explanation, no closure, no clarity, and you build a conclusion to fill the silence. I wasn't enough. And that thought becomes your filter. Every new interaction is interpreted through it. Every new interaction is interpreted through it. Every delay feels like confirmation. Every distance feels like rejection. And that is how loneliness compounds, not because people keep leaving, but because you expect them to. An expectation changes behavior. You hold back, you test, you withdraw early, and that behavior creates exactly what you feared: distance, disconnection, and then you say, I knew it, reinforcing the belief that started it. And this is the next lesson. Unchallenged beliefs create self-fulfilling isolation, because you begin to act in ways that produce the outcome you already expect, and that outcome strengthens the belief again. Elijah did the same. One voice, one threat, and he acted as if it was already reality. He did not question it, did not test it, did not confront it. He accepted it. And that acceptance shaped his movement. And this is where the next truth cuts deep. Not everything you feel is true, and not everything you hear is true, and not everything you hear accurate. But if you do not challenge it, it becomes your truth by default. And that is where most people fail. They do not examine what they believe. They simply react to it. And reaction builds patterns faster than reflection because it is repeated without interruption. And that repetition becomes identity. This is just how I am, when in reality, it is how you have been responding. And this is why the correction matters so much, because God did not validate Elijah's fear. He redirected him. He gave him instruction, movement, connection, truth that contradicted what he believed. And that contradiction is what begins to break the pattern, because now there is something stronger than the fear, something that challenges it. And if you accept that, the belief weakens. But if you ignore it, the belief remains dominant. And that is why the next lesson is critical. You must confront what you believe with something stronger than what created it, because belief does not disappear on its own. It is replaced, and without replacement, it persists. A simple moment, someone invites you into something, a conversation, a group, an opportunity, and your first instinct is hesitation, doubt, resistance, not because of the situation, but because of what you already believe. And that is where everything either changes or stays the same. Because if you follow that instinct, you reinforce the pattern. But if you challenge it, even slightly, even imperfectly, you begin to create a new one. And that new pattern, repeated, becomes your new default. And that is how isolation breaks, not through one big moment, but through consistent interruption of the beliefs that created it. And without that interruption, nothing changes, no matter how much you understand, because understanding without action leaves the pattern intact. And the pattern is what defines your life. A list of outcomes that looks like truth but isn't, and it forms quietly inside you after a few repeated experiences. People leave, no one stays, it's always me. And once those statements settle, they begin to operate like laws, not ideas. And this is where the next lesson becomes unavoidable. Loneliness hardens. When you turn experiences into rules, because rules do not get questioned, they get followed. And once you follow them, you begin to act in ways that make them real. You stop opening up. You hold back trust. You assume distance before it happens. And that assumption shapes your behavior in every interaction. And over time, those interactions start to reflect exactly what you expected. not because it was inevitable, but because it was reinforced. A real situation. Someone cancels plans twice. Nothing dramatic, just small inconsistencies. And instead of seeing it as a specific situation, you attach it to your rule. People don't value me. And that thought changes how you respond. You pull back, you stop initiating, you reduce effort, and the other person feels that shift without knowing why. They mirror it, and now the connection weakens, confirming your belief again. And that is how isolation builds, not through major events, but through interpretation of minor ones, repeated and reinforced until they define your reality. And this is exactly what Elijah did in the cave. I am the only one left. 1 Kings chapter 19. A statement that sounds final, but was not true. It was a conclusion formed from limited perspective, and that is the danger. When a conclusion feels complete, you stop searching for anything that contradicts it. And this is where the correction becomes critical, because God did not comfort Elijah with agreement. He corrected him with truth. I reserve 7,000 in Israel, 1 Kings chapter 19. And that number matters, not because of its size, but because it breaks the illusion of isolation. It shows that what he believed was incomplete, and incomplete beliefs create complete limitations if they are not challenged, and that is the next lesson. You must actively look for evidence that contradicts your isolation, because your mind will not do it automatically. It will filter for what supports what you already believe and ignore what doesn't. And that is how confirmation bias works, not as a theory, but as a daily process shaping your perception. A simple moment, someone responds differently than expected, shows interest, offers support, and instead of accepting it, you question it, minimize it, or ignore it because it does not fit your rule. And that is where most people lose their way. Not because connection is absent, but because they reject what does not match their expectation. And over time, that rejection becomes automatic, and then they say, it never happens, when in reality it did, but they did not allow it to register. And that is why the next lesson cuts deep. Healing requires you to accept what contradicts your past, not just understand it. Because understanding without acceptance does not change behavior. And behavior is what determines whether new patterns form or old ones continue. And this is where everything shifts, because the moment you begin to question your rules, even slightly, even inconsistently, you create space for something new, not immediately, not completely, but enough to interrupt the pattern. And that interruption is what breaks the cycle over time, because now you are no longer operating on automatic conclusions. You are choosing your interpretation, and that choice changes how you act, how you respond, how you connect. And without that, nothing changes, because the rule remains in place, shaping everything silently. And that is how loneliness becomes a system, not just a feeling, until you decide to confront it at the level it was built, not externally, but internally. A moment that looks small but decides everything. Someone actually shows up, stays, listens, and instead of relief, you feel tension, because it doesn't match what you've been telling yourself for so long. And that tension is where most people make the wrong move. They pull back, they test, they create distance, not because the connection is wrong, but because it challenges what they believe. And this is where the next lesson becomes unavoidable. You don't just resist pain, you also resist what could heal you if it doesn't feel familiar, because familiarity feels safe even when it's damaging, and unfamiliar truth feels risky even when it's right. And this is exactly why Elijah had to be corrected, not comforted, because comfort would have left the pattern intact, but correction forces a choice. Accept something new or stay where you are. A real situation. Someone tries to get closer to you, asks questions, shows consistency, and instead of leaning in, you become cautious, distant, analyzing every detail, looking for what will go wrong. And that behavior is not protection, it is preservation of your old belief. Because if the connection works, your belief collapses, and that collapse is uncomfortable. It requires you to admit that what you thought was true is no longer accurate. And most people avoid that moment, not consciously, but through subtle actions, delayed responses, emotional distance, reduced effort, and over time, that behavior weakens the connection until it breaks, and then the belief is confirmed again, and this is the next lesson. You can sabotage real connection to protect a false identity, and if you don't see it, you will. Repeat it without realizing why everything keeps ending the same way. Elijah was given truth that contradicted his isolation. I reserve 7,000. 1 Kings chapter 19. But that truth required acceptance, not just hearing. And that is where the shift happens, because hearing something new does not change you. Accepting it does. And acceptance is not passive. It changes how you respond, how you act, how you interpret everything that follows. And that is where most people stop. They understand something is different, but they do not live as if it is. And without that, nothing changes. Because behavior stays aligned with the old belief. A simple pattern. Someone reaches out. You respond briefly, they respond again. You delay, they pull back, and then you say, "See, it never lasts." But what actually happened is that you controlled the outcome through your response, and that is where responsibility becomes unavoidable, because once you see the pattern, you can no longer pretend it's random. It is being created, step by step. Decision by decision, and that is uncomfortable because it removes the idea that you are just experiencing loneliness and replaces it with the reality that you are participating in it, and that participation is what must change. And this is where the correction becomes real, because the next time the moment appears, the next time someone stays, listens, reaches out, you have a choice. Respond from what you believed before, or respond from what you now know is possible. And that choice will feel unnatural at first, unstable, even wrong, because it contradicts your pattern. But that is exactly why it matters, because change never feels natural at the beginning. It becomes natural through repetition, and that repetition is what rewrites your default. And without it, everything returns to the same place, no matter how much you understand. Because understanding does not change outcomes, behavior does, and behavior only changes when you choose differently in the moment where it matters, not later, not in theory, but right there when the pattern tries to repeat itself again. A quiet moment after everything settles, no crisis, no urgency, just space. And that is where loneliness often returns, strongest, not in chaos, but in stillness. Because stillness exposes what distraction was hiding, and this is where the next lesson becomes unavoidable. Loneliness is not only something you escape, it is something you must learn to stand in without collapsing, because if you cannot hold yourself in silence, you will always depend on noise to feel stable. And that dependence will control your choices, your relationships, your direction, and that is why Elijah's story does not end with constant activity. It includes stillness, presence, a different kind of quiet, one that is not empty, but anchored. The Lord was not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, and after the fire came a gentle whisper. 1 Kings chapter 19, and that whisper matters because it represents connection without noise, presence without distraction, and most people are not used to that. They fill every gap, every silence, every pause, and because of that, they never build the ability to remain stable when nothing is happening. A real situation, you sit alone without your phone, without music, without conversation, and within minutes your mind starts moving, replaying conversations, imagining scenarios, questioning yourself, and that discomfort pushes you to reach for something, anything to fill the space, and that reaction is automatic. Not because you chose it, but because you trained it, and that is where the next lesson cuts deep. You cannot build real connection if you cannot tolerate being alone without escaping it, because escape prevents you from understanding what is actually happening inside you, and without that understanding, you will carry the same patterns into every interaction, using people to regulate what you never learned, to regulate yourself. Elijah had to listen in stillness, not to noise, not to spectacle, but to something quieter. Something that required attention instead of reaction. And that is where most people struggle. because attention without distraction feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, and that discomfort is often misinterpreted as a problem instead of a process. But it is the process. It is where your internal state begins to stabilize, not through external input, but through alignment. And that alignment changes how you experience everything else, because now you are not constantly reacting, you are aware, present, able to choose instead of default. And this is where the shift becomes practical, because the next time you are alone, the next time silence appears, instead of filling it immediately, you stay in it a little longer. You observe what rises, what repeats, what feels unstable, and instead of escaping it, you confront it, not with force, but with attention, because attention is what reveals patterns, and once a pattern is visible, it can be changed. But if it remains hidden under constant distraction, it continues unchecked, shaping your behavior without you realizing it. And this is where loneliness begins to transform, not by removing the feeling, but by changing your response to it. Because once you can remain stable in stillness, loneliness loses its control. It no longer forces you into reaction, into escape, into dependency. It becomes something you can move through without being defined by it. And that is the difference between those who are trapped by it and those who are not. One avoids it, the other understands it, and that understanding is what breaks its power over time. A moment that most people rush past without realizing its weight. Someone actually stays, not perfectly, not constantly, but consistently enough to matter. And instead of relief, something else rises: suspicion, tension, the need to test it, to control it, to make sure it won't leave the way others did. And this is where the next lesson becomes unavoidable. Loneliness does not end when connection appears. It is tested when connection remains, because what you built in isolation does not disappear automatically. It follows you into every relationship, shaping how you respond, how you trust, how you interpret every small change. And if you don't see that, you will recreate distance inside connection itself. A real situation. Someone doesn't reply for a few hours. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual, but your mind fills the gap instantly. Something changed. They're pulling away. And that thought creates a reaction. You become colder, less open, less responsive. And when they finally reply, they feel the shift. They don't understand it, but they adjust. And that adjustment creates exactly what you feared. Distance, not because it was there, but because it was introduced through your response. And this is where the next lesson cuts deep. You can destroy connection by reacting to what hasn't happened, because your behavior is shaped by interpretation, not reality. And if that interpretation is wrong, everything that follows will be built on something unstable. Elijah was corrected not only in his isolation, but in his perception. I reserve 7,000, 1 Kings chapter 19. And that truth required him to stop assuming he was alone and start seeing what was actually there. And this is where most people struggle, not in finding connection, but in recognizing it. Because recognition requires you to let go of the expectation that it will fail, and that expectation feels safer than risk. Because if you expect it to fail, you think you are protecting yourself, but what you are actually doing is preventing it from growing. A simple pattern: someone stays consistent, and instead of receiving it, you look for flaws, delays, inconsistencies, anything that confirms your belief, and that search becomes your focus. And whatever you focus on expands, so the connection starts to feel unstable, even if it wasn't. And over time, that perception shapes your actions, and your actions shape the outcome. And that outcome reinforces the belief again. And this is how loneliness survives, even inside relationships, not because connection is absent, but because it is not allowed to stabilize. And this is where the correction becomes practical, because the next time the moment appears, the next time there is a delay, a pause, a gap, you stop yourself. Before reacting, you question the interpretation, not the situation, because the situation is often neutral, but your interpretation is not. And that pause is where everything changes, because it breaks the automatic response. And without the automatic response, the pattern cannot complete itself. And if the pattern cannot complete, it begins to weaken. And this is where connection starts to hold. Not because it became perfect, but because you stopped disrupting it with assumptions that were never true to begin with. And that shift is what most people never make. Because it requires awareness in the moment, not after, and discipline to respond differently when it feels unnatural. And without that, nothing changes, because the same reaction keeps producing the same outcome, even when the situation is different. A quiet evening, nothing dramatic, no crisis, no noise, just a moment where you notice something has changed, not outside first, but inside. The same space that once felt empty now feels stable, not full, not perfect, but no longer collapsing under its own weight. And that is where the final lesson becomes unavoidable. Loneliness is not cured when people arrive. It is cured when your position inside yourself changes, because without that shift, no amount of connection will hold. And with that shift, even small connection becomes enough to grow something real. Elijah did not leave the wilderness as a different man because the world changed around him. He left because his understanding changed. His position shifted. His perception was corrected, and that correction altered everything that followed. Go back the way you came. 1 Kings chapter 19. Not because nothing happened, but because now he could re-enter without being controlled by what he believed before. And that is the difference. Not avoiding the same places, but returning to them with a different response. And that response determines whether the past repeats or ends. A real situation, you meet someone new or reconnect with someone familiar, and instead of carrying the weight of everything that happened before, you stay present. You respond to what is actually happening, not what you expect to happen. And that changes the interaction immediately, because now you are not reacting from history, you are choosing in the moment. And that choice creates a different outcome. Not because the situation is perfect, but because your response is no longer predictable, no longer controlled by the same pattern. And this is where the shift becomes permanent, because once you respond differently enough times, the old pattern loses its strength, not instantly, but consistently, until it is no longer your default. And when it is no longer your default, loneliness loses its foundation, because it was never just about being alone. It was about how you responded to being alone, how you interpreted connection, how you reacted under uncertainty. And once those responses change, the entire structure that supported loneliness begins to collapse. Be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46. And this is not passive, it is alignment. It is the ability to remain grounded without needing constant confirmation, constant reassurance, constant presence, and that stability changes how you connect. Because now, you are not trying to escape loneliness through people, you are building connection from a place that is already steady. And that difference creates depth instead of dependency. And this is where responsibility becomes clear, because once you see the pattern, once you understand how it formed, how it repeats, how it can be interrupted, you cannot go back to thinking it is random. You cannot pretend it is just something that happens to you, because now you know it is something you participate in, and that participation is what must change, not once, but consistently, in every moment where the old pattern tries to return. And that is where everything is decided, not in one big moment, but in small, repeated choices, when you stay instead of withdrawing, when you respond instead of assuming, when you question the thought instead of following it. And those choices, repeated, become your new pattern, and that pattern becomes your new reality. And that reality no longer supports the loneliness that once defined you. Because loneliness was never just about being alone, it was about what you believed, how you reacted, what you reinforced. And once those change, even if you find yourself alone again, it no longer feels the same. It no longer controls you. It no longer defines what happens next. And that is the line that separates those who remain trapped from those who move forward, not what they feel, but what they choose to do with it, again and again, until the old pattern has nothing left to hold on to.